Hello, my name is Siobhan and I'm the Education Officer at the National Museum of Ireland Archaeology. I'd like to welcome you to the third and final talk in our online series exploring medieval objects associated with St Columba. And this series is part of a programme being run by the National Museum of Ireland for the Colmcille 1500. The programme includes a new exhibition about St Columba, which was curated by Dr. Niamh Curtin, the Irish Antiquities Division, and which is just open to the public to celebrate the 1500th anniversary of his death. So today's lecture is by Dr. Griffin Murray. And so hello, Dr. Murray.
Hello, Siobhan. Thanks very much. Delighted to be here today.
Thank you. Well, today I think you're going to talk to us about St Columba's crosier power and devotion in medieval Ireland. And you're going to explore the crosiers and the important role they played in representing the power of the early Irish saints in medieval Ireland. Now, Dr. Griffin Murray is a lecturer in archaeology at University College Cork, and he is author of The Cross of Cong, a masterpiece of medieval Irish art, which was published in 2014, and is a specialist in Irish medieval church metalwork. So it's great that you're part of this series, Griffin. Now, just to say, the talk will now start for you who are watching. It will end in just over 30 minutes, and we will have an online question and answer session after it. So at the end of the talk. So if you have any questions, what you can do is we will prompt you to put them into the chat box. So the chat box will come up and you can pose any questions that you have to us at that stage. But for the moment, if you would all like to sit back and just listen for the next half hour, and we will talk to you again in around half an hour's time.
In this lecture, the third and final one in the Columcille 1500 lecture series, we're going to look at a religious staff, or crosier, associated with the saint. So far in the series, we have looked at bells and book shrines. Now we turn our attention to crosiers. These three object types represent the trinity of relics often associated with Irish saints, and therefore it may be no surprise that the collections of the National Museum of Ireland have examples of all three associated with Columcille, or Columba, as he is also known. Nevertheless, survival from the Middle Ages is fragmentary, and so Columba is, in fact, unique in this honour. The same, for instance, cannot be said for relics associated with Patrick, or indeed Bridget, the other prominent national saints. Here on the screen we see a drawing of a carving by George Petrie in the 19th century. It's of a carving showing three ecclesiastical figures, the central one holding a book, the one on the left holding a crosier, and the one on the right holding a bell. The dissolution of the monasteries and the Reformation under Henry VIII and successive waves of war in Ireland have been very unkind to our medieval churches and their furnishings and relics. It is only what could be hidden away that has survived, and this material is often damaged and fragmentary. So when it comes to the object I want to talk to you about today, St Columba's crosier from Durrow in County Offaly, we are dealing with a damaged and incomplete object. As such, it is less well known than other reliquaries associated with the saint, such as the Shrine of the Cathaoirleach, which we learned about in the last talk in this series. Not only is the object broken in two, but its foot and most of its head or crook are also missing. To give you an idea of what the object would have looked like when complete, I'm showing you another crosier from County Offaly, at this time from Clonmacnoise, which is on display in the Treasury in the National Museum of Ireland. But what is a crosier? Essentially, a crosier is a religious staff of office. In the same way that a king or queen might carry a scepter, or a mayor or university chancellor may have a mace carried before them, a crosier is a symbol of church office. Today, you will see bishops carrying them on important occasions, essentially indicating their status and the power of that office. But unlike the mace, which has a military origin, the crosier is based on the shepherd's crook, and so also indicates the pastoral responsibility that the office holder has in looking after their religious community or flock. There are, of course, many biblical analogies to God and Jesus as a shepherd for his people. So when we look at early Irish crosiers, we can see that they are the same shape as a shepherd's crook, with the distinctive curve at the top. Most are around 1 metre in height and so differ from later medieval and modern crosiers, which generally tend to be taller. Early Irish crosiers are all made in the same way. They have a wooden core, usually of yew wood, to which metal fittings are nailed. The shaft is covered in metal tubes, usually of bronze, which are sealed by vertical binding strips. The sections of tubing are connected by barrel-shaped knops, and they are fitted with a crook at the top and a foot at the bottom. They vary in levels of decoration from reasonably plain, such as this example on the right, to highly ornate, such as the Clonmacnoise example on the left, which is decorated with inlaid silver, niello, and enamel. And this level of decoration probably relates both to the resources and craftsmanship available to the individual monastery. Ireland is distinct in having the largest collection of early crosiers in Western Europe, most of which are held in the collections of the National Museum of Ireland. They have been preserved for centuries because of their status as relics of the early Irish saints. However, none of them, including St Columba's crosier, are as old as the saints that they are associated with. Our earliest examples date from between the 7th and 9th centuries and are just fragments, while the earliest complete examples date from between the 10th and the 12th centuries. St Columba's crosier, like other examples, was made as a staff of office for the abbot of the monastery at Durrow, who was regarded as the successor of Columba. Therefore, it was the abbot who was the saint's representative on earth. These staffs were passed down from abbot to abbot, and so were not personal possessions, but belonged to the monastery and therefore the saint. This is how these objects were associated with the saints, and over time their antiquity led people to believe that these were the staffs of the saints themselves, and that is how they gained relic status. When modern scholars started writing about these objects, they realized that they were not as old as the saints they were said to have belonged to, and so assumed that the relic must be contained within the objects, that the wooden core was an enshrined relic. But this was to misunderstand them. The wooden cores that they all contain are structural supports that were fashioned to receive metal mounts and are contemporary with them. This has been demonstrated through examination of some wooden cores and also by radiocarbon dating. And you can see here, this is the foot of the prosperous crosier, and the metal foot is actually removed here. It's alongside it, and you can see the wooden core inside, which tapers to a fine point and could never have been used independently. So, while certainly regarded as relics in the later and post-medieval period, it was the whole object that was regarded as such, metal mounts included. And this distinguishes these objects from, say, book shrines, which are containers, the book itself being the relic. The crosier may be the more bachel or great staff that is mentioned in the 12th century Irish life of Columba, as discussed by Cormac Burke, and which was referred to by Manus O'Donnell and John Colgan in the 16th and 17th centuries, respectively. In the early 19th century, the crosier was kept at Jamestown Court, near Castletowngeoghegan in County Westmeath, home of Sir Richard Nagle. Nagle was descended from the McGeogans, who were minor kings in the area, in a territory known as Kennel Fiachach, that roughly equates with the modern barony of Moy-Cashel, which is largely in County Westmeath, but straddles County Offaly, in particular the area around Durrow. The crosier appears to have been handed down within the McGeoghan family, its hereditary keepers. The crosier was described by the English writer James Norris Brewer in 1826, following a visit to Jamestown Court. And this is a quote from Brewer. In Jamestown House is preserved a curious relic, which exhibits the unquestionable marks of a remote antiquity. This is called the baculum or crosier of St Columcille, the patron of the McGeoghan's territory. It is composed of oak overlaid with plates of copper rudely nailed and fastened. About 4 feet of the shaft, which formerly was longer, still remain. The rest has been broken off and lost. The volute or top of the crosier is, in like manner, separated from the shaft, and a part of it is no longer in existence. This volute is of bronze, inlaid with gold and silver lines representing various figures. It is also set with precious stones and gems, and covers, like the plates of the shaft, a piece of oak. Doubtless, this sacred antique had been committed to the safekeeping of the dynasty of Moy-Cashel by the monks of Kilbeggan at the period of the Reformation and dissolution of religious houses. The crosier appears to have been in similar condition when Brewer saw it as it is today, although no precious stones or gems survive. An association with Kilbeggan is unlikely, as the principal site connected with St Columba in the area is Durrow. Richard Nagle died in November 1850, leaving no heir. Afterwards, a Gilbert Nugent lived at Jamestown Court. In December 1850, the crosier, along with other objects, were sold by Mr. Nugent to the Royal Irish Academy for their museum for the sum of £10. The minutes of the Royal Irish Academy record that on the 18th of December 1850, they acquired the shaft and upper boss of a very ancient crosier, supposed to be the crosier of St Columba, formerly belonging to the Abbey of Durrow in the county Meath. Read Offaly for that. Also 11 Anglo-Saxon coins found at Durrow, 2 bronze pins, one of them very ancient, found at Moat, with a silver bodkin and a horn powder flask of the reign of William III. This crosier, although unfortunately much mutilated, is of particular historical interest. It still retains some traces of its original magnificence and must have been a beautiful specimen of ancient Irish art. It was preserved since the dissolution of monasteries by the Mac Geoghegan family, lately represented by Sir Richard Nagle, at whose death it became the property of Mr. Nugent, who consented to part with it for the museum, along with other antiquities here mentioned. The crosier was displayed in the Academy's museum and soon after was catalogued by Sir William Wilde in his unfinished catalogue of ecclesiastical antiquities, which was later posthumously published by Edmund Armstrong in 1915. In 1890, the crosier moved with the rest of the Academy's collection to the National Museum of Ireland, where it remains. While featuring in a number of archaeological catalogues and books in the early 20th century, it was more fully discussed and analysed by Cormac Burke in his book Studies in the Cult of St Columba in 1997. The crosier is currently on display with other objects associated with the saint as part of the new Colmcille 1500 exhibition in the National Museum in Kildare Street, and I would urge people to go and see it. St Columba's crosier is in a worn and fragmentary state. As mentioned, the foot and most of the head or crook no longer survive, and what remains of the crosier is now in two parts. One section, the upper one here on the screen, consists of the top knop, a collar and false openwork, and the base of the crook. The other, larger section consists of most of the shaft, along with two barrel-shaped knops. Both sections retain the wooden core, which gives them their structural stability. The crosier has undergone considerable alterations over time, with successive waves of repairs, many of the interventions crudely carried out. The crosier is perhaps difficult to interpret at first, but by taking a chronological approach, we might hope to understand it a little better. I will start with the upper section of the crosier, which is also the most decorative surviving part. The top knop is the earliest element, and that is this section here that you can see, this barrel-shaped knop here on the screen in the central part. This was gilded, and its ornament is divided into three bands of knotted interlace, with the central thinner band punctuated by four rectangular settings. And you can see two of those there. There's one there and another there. These settings, although now empty, probably contained amber studs, perhaps the precious stones and gems mentioned by Brewer. This knop may be dated to the 9th century, but is reused in its present context. And this can be seen where it has been filed down to accommodate later mounts, as you can see here on this side of the crosier, where the knop has actually been filed down to accommodate a now missing later mount. In contrast, the ornament around this knop can be dated to the early 12th century. This includes the large downward-facing gilt animal head that formed the terminal of the now missing crest. So that's this element here. And I'll just show you a detail of that here and here. So this large animal head here, there's his eye, there's his ear. This is decorated with elaborate intertwining tendril-like hair and mustache. Its eyes were originally set with now missing glass studs, and its snout and ears are also depicted. The remnants of the crook survive above the knop and is divided into recessed openwork panels that would have originally contained decorative plaques, and that's this section here, but is broken off here. Below the knop, a collar is attached, also dating from the early 12th century, and that's this section here, and that's it in close-up. It is decorated in a false openwork that has traces of gilding. The decoration consists of 4 snake-like animals that form figures of 8 with their bodies, which are intertwined with thinner offshoots. And this is an expanded view of the drawing from around the knop, and you can see the figures, the animals there. That's his head there, and he curls back to form a figure of 8 here. As you can see, their heads project down below the collar, 2 of which are lost, while the remaining 2 have been bent inwards. This decoration shows influence from the Urnes style, a late Viking art style popular in Irish metalwork in the early 12th century. It is clear from the number of nails and nail holes in the piece that all of these elements have been remounted. The internal copper tube, which you can see protruding here, also seems to be secondary, as is a rivet on the base of the crest to which a tiny piece of silver sheet is attached. This suggests that the crosier was covered in silver sheeting at a later point, but has since been stripped from the crosier. Sometime after the crosier was broken in 2, someone tried to reunite the 2 pieces using 2 long metal pins, which now protrude from the wooden core of the upper section. The other part of the crosier consists of a wooden core covered in bronze tubing and with 2 barrel-shaped knops, and you can see them here in close-up. The vertical binding strips, which would have sealed the bronze tubes, are now missing, and you can see that they reveal, because they're missing, it reveals the wooden core inside. The middle knop of the crosier is largely plain, except for a band of inlaid silver that runs around the centre. In contrast, the lowermost knop was highly decorated, but this is now difficult to discern due to wear. The decoration consists of 2 bands of animals, each consisting of overlapping 4-legged animals seen in profile, which are intertwined by snakes. And so again, this is an expanded drawing of the ornament on this knop. I know it's very difficult to see, it's very worn, but perhaps you can see one of the animal heads here. There's his eye and his mouth and his long neck connecting with his body. So you have this series of animals intertwined by these smaller looping snakes. You can see the head of one snake there. The animals and snakes were inlaid with silver, while the background was inlaid with yellow, a black-coloured material. Again, we can see influence here from the Urnes style, and both style and technique are consistent with the date in the early 12th century. There is a long section of shaft at the end of the crosier without any knop, which is unusual, and the 2 knops on this section of the crosier have also been remounted. So we have our 2 knops here, but you can see here that there's none in this long section here. As I say, this is odd. Again, fragments of silver sheeting and silver nails on the shaft indicate that the bronze tubing was at some point covered in silver sheet. And here is the middle knop again, but you might be able to just see there, peeking out from under it is the silver sheeting. Again, it's been stripped from the crosier, but just a little bit remains here, wedged under the middle knop here. St Columba's crosier is distinct in being of larger than usual dimensions. When the two pieces are joined together, it measures around 1.3 meters high. Considering that most of the head and the foot are missing, it must have been at least 1.5 meters in height when complete. This is at odds with most of the other surviving early crosiers from Ireland, which were much smaller. The Clonmacnoise crosier, for instance, is less than a metre high. In fact, the dimensions of St Columba's crosier are akin to later medieval crosiers. All of the elements of the crosier are remounted, and where one would expect to find a fourth knop on the lower shaft, there is none. Furthermore, we know that much of the crosier was later covered with silver sheeting. This suggests to me that the whole crosier was remounted and lengthened in the later medieval period to bring it in line with contemporary crosiers. Therefore, we have established three principal phases for the crosier. A 9th century phase represented by the top knop, an early 12th century phase to which most decorative elements belong, and a later medieval phase, perhaps in the 14th or 15th century, when the whole crosier was remounted on a new and longer wooden core and was redecorated with silver sheeting. The precise date of the third phase is unknown, but future radiocarbon dating of the wooden core may resolve this. We know that decorative metalwork was being carried out at Durrow in the later medieval period, as evidenced by the 14th century goldsmith's die for die stamping metal that was found near there. The practice of refurbishing and adding to these objects was commonplace. We saw it very clearly with the multiple phases of the Shrine of the Cathaoc, as expertly explained by Dr. Paul Malarkey in the last lecture. However, there is a fourth or final phase in the case of St Columba's crosier, and that is a destructive phase that saw the stripping of the silver sheet and loss of most of its crook and foot, damage that was probably inflicted intentionally in the 16th or 17th century. The crosier was also broken in two at some point before Brewer described it in 1826. While there are no records of how St Columba's crosier was used as a relic, we have evidence from other early crosiers that can inform us. Another crosier associated with Columba, called the Cock Buddha, was held at Dunkeld Cathedral in Perthshire, Scotland. Its name, which means battle victory, is similar to that of the Shrine of the Cathaoc. Like the Cathaoc, we know historically that from the 9th century, this crosier was brought into battle to protect and bring victory to the forces of the Scots, and was used in this way in battles against the Vikings. Unfortunately, this crosier no longer survives and was probably destroyed during the Reformation. Importantly, however, it is represented on a 13th century seal of the chapter of Dunkeld Cathedral, where it is represented over the shrine of Columba. You can see that in the center of the seal here. There's the crosier. Another crosier, the Ger Beroch from Termonbarry in County Roscommon, is associated with St Beroch or St Barry and is mentioned in the 15th century saint's life. The Irish scholar John O'Donovan recorded in 1837 that the Ger Beroch was used to kill the worm and the fairies and cure the blast. William Wilde later recorded how it had been handed down through the O'Hanleys of Slieve Bawn in the county of Roscommon, the hereditary Erenachs of St Barry, and that it had been used for swearing on and was sent for from great distances for this purpose in cases of stolen goods or defamation. However, in many instances, by the 1830s and 40s, that reverence was beginning to wane and was actively discouraged by the Catholic Church. It is at that point that we see these objects being sold to antiquarian collectors and museums. Said to have been founded by Columba in the 6th century, Durrow was one of the most important Columban monasteries in Ireland and enjoyed a long history. Today it is perhaps best known for its important early Gospel book, the Book of Durrow, dating to the second half of the 7th century, which is now in the library of Trinity College Dublin. Notably, the Book of Durrow was also regarded as a relic of Columba and was enshrined by Flann Cinna, King of Midda and High King of Ireland, sometime in the late 9th or early 10th century. The shrine survived until the later 17th century, but was since lost. Equally so, Durrow is known for its magnificent sculptural high cross, a work that Roger Stally dates to the early 10th century and has attributed to what he terms the Murdoch master, who also carved crosses for Kells, Duleek, Clonmacnoise, and Monaster Boyce. Also preserved at the site are several finely carved decorative early medieval grave slabs, dating perhaps from the 9th century. This suggests that Durrow was of considerable importance around this time. While St Columba's crosier is mainly early 12th century in date, we have seen that its upper knop was reused from an earlier crosier, dating from around the 9th century. The reuse of a piece of an earlier crosier cannot have simply been utilitarian, but presumably this knop came from an earlier crosier from Durrow, and its reuse held meaning. Nevertheless, it was not treated like a relic, but as we have seen, was modified and filed down by the 12th century craftsman to suit its new purpose. The early crosier that this knop came from is broadly in line with the flurry of activity at the site in the 9th and early 10th centuries, and may have been commissioned around the same time as the shrine for the Book of Durrow. A small hoard of 11 Anglo-Saxon coins was found at the site, which were acquired by the Royal Irish Academy at the same time as the crosier, and these coins were published by Michael Dolly in the early 1970s, who dated their deposition to around 940. While no buildings survive at the site today, a large ecclesiastical enclosure has been picked up in aerial photography. The early 18th century church at the site probably occupies the site of the main medieval church, although there would have been a number of churches originally. On top of this Georgian church was placed the head of another stone cross, and this fell down in the 1970s and is now in the National Museum of Ireland. It probably dates from the early 12th century and depicts the crucifixion on one side and a figure carrying a crosier and perhaps a book on the other. Ryan O'Flynn has discussed the textual evidence that suggests that a finger bone of Columba was kept as a relic at Durrow from the 12th century. St Columba's crosier, as we have seen, largely dates from the same period and represents renewed activity and patronage at the site. This renewed interest in Durrow can also be seen in contemporary Irish poetry, which has been ascribed to Columba, but which dates from the 11th and 12th centuries. In this poetry, the saint looks back to Ireland from his exile in Scotland. Happy for Dima's son in his holy abbey, where I might hear what would delight my mind in Durrow in the west. And that's dated from around the year 1000. The three best beloved places I have left in the people world are Durrow, Derry, and Tir Lugjuk. And that line of poetry, which I'm giving here in translation into English, dates from the 12th century. In the early 12th century, at this time of renewed activity, Durrow was patronised by Murchad Ua Mael Sheachlan, who was king of Meath on and off from around 1106 to 1155. Indeed, Murchad and his wife were buried at Durrow, as was his son Mael Sheachlan, who, we are told, died from a poisoned drink in 1155. It is thought that Murchad also founded an Augustinian abbey dedicated to St. Mary at Durrow in the 1140s. In 1125, Turlough O'Connor banished Murchad to Munster and split the kingdom of Meath in four. However, the following year, Murchad regained his kingdom. Notably, as discussed by Cormac Burke, there are comparisons between St Columba's crosier and contemporary metalwork in Munster. For example, the openwork collar on St Lochdine's arm from Dunamore in County Cork provides the best parallel for the collar on the crosier. Also, the animal head terminal on the crest finds a close parallel on the Lismore crosier from County Waterford. The Lismore crosier dates from before 1113, while St Lochdine's arm dates from between 1118 and 1121. And you can see both also in the Treasury exhibition in the National Museum. Murchad's connections with Munster in 1125 may have led to a Munster craftsman or Munster-based trained craftsman working at Durrow, thus explaining the Munster connections in this Midland object. Despite its condition, St Columba's crosier is a very significant object from the Middle Ages and an important part of the cult of the saint. By examining this crosier in detail, we are able to learn a great deal about it, both it and its background in Durrow. Importantly, we have learned that it was not a static object, but has gone through several phases and transformations, which is testament to the significance of this object over millennia. I hope that people will have the opportunity to see and enjoy this object for themselves, which is now on exhibition in the National Museum of Ireland in Kildare Street. Before I finish, I would like to thank Siobhan Pearce and Tricia Ryan for organising this lecture series and for inviting me to speak. Maeve Sikora, Keeper of Irish Antiquities, for her advice and help, Richard Wynock of the Photography Department for images, and Paul Malarkey of the Conservation Department for advice. I would also like to thank John Sheehan of UCC for information and Kevin O'Dwyer for the images of Durrow. And finally, I'd like to thank you, the audience, very much for listening here today.
Hello, thank you very much, Griffin, for that great talk about St Columba's and the Crosiers associated with him. And I suppose you can see all the work that goes into gathering all the information and the research together and trying to synopsize it in half an hour and share it with us. So I know an awful lot of work goes into creating these talks and lectures. So I would like to say thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. I just want to say as well, before we go to the questions, I would like to thank also Cormac Burke and Paul Malarkey as well for their talks. And I think it has been a great series. You know, it's really built up a great body of work to share with the public around those objects that are associated with St Columba and that I suppose that are on display now in that new exhibition. So it's a great resource for people because we will be posting the lectures online already. Paul's and Cormac's are available to view on the museum website. And Griffin, thank you very much as well. We will be also sharing your lectures. So if anybody wants to go back over and just sort of to sort of see some of those images and have a think about some of the points that you made, they can do so in the coming weeks. So I suppose there's just a few questions coming in there. And I suppose the first question just is coming in. It's just around the mention of a crosier from Kells. Is there a crosier associated with St Columba from Kells?
Yeah, Siobhan, yes and no. I didn't speak about it during the lecture because there is a crosier that was found very excitingly in London in 1850 when a Catholic solicitor's office who had died, his chambers were being cleared out, and they moved a cupboard that supposedly hadn't been moved for 60 years, and out from behind it fell this magnificent crosier. But unfortunately, that's all we know about it. There was a really wonderful study done of this crosier back in the 1950s by Maura McDermott. Really excellent. You know, nothing has really surpassed it. That crosier carries an inscription, which is great. Sometimes we can tell an awful lot from inscriptions. Unfortunately, it names two individuals, a male Finnan and a Cúdulig. Both names are pretty popular in early medieval Ireland. And on that basis, she attributed it to Kells, but I would say that that's inconclusive. So we don't know that for certain. We don't really know where that crosier came from. So I didn't speak about it in the talk today, although of course there's many other objects from Kells. There's the high crosses again. I brought that in. Of course, there's the Book of Kells itself, which again had a metalwork cover as well. We know that historically, and there's a crucifixion plaque from Kells and other things like that. So Kells has its fair share of material associated with.
And an amazing material, I have to say, such amazing objects. Now there is a lot of questions coming in, so I'm just going to ask the next one. How can we explain or determine the usage of the animal images on the crosiers? So that's the interlaced animal images, maybe, and maybe the at the top of the crosier as well.
Yeah, sure. That's a really good question, and you know, people who answer questions saying that's a really good question usually don't have an answer for it. So likewise, I don't. I mean, animal art came into use in Ireland in the 7th century, and it came through kind of I suppose the Saxons and the Anglo-Saxons, and came in. Actually, one of the earliest objects that we see this animal interlace on is the Book of Durrow itself. Late 7th century manuscript now in Trinity College. So really important. Does it have a meaning? People have kind of, I suppose, theorized on this. We can't be certain. We don't know. I mean, there's a lot of things that we really don't know. All I can say about the animal ornament on the crosier and on other kind of contemporary metalwork is it's very, in this period, is that it's very fantastic. They don't seem really to be depicting actual animals, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
That's something that we see later within the later medieval period. You get identifiable animals, but these interlaced beasts seem to be fantastic. Perhaps it has been suggested, I've even kind of speculated myself a little, perhaps maybe it had a sort of a protective symbolism around the object, but we don't know, and I don't know if we'll ever know for certain. But great question.
It is, and it deserves a lecture in itself almost, I think. One other question that came in is just the fact that it was made of oak. Is there any significance to that, and not that it's particularly they chose the wood of oak?
Very, very exciting. Another great question there, actually. It's probably, yes, in the description that the quote that I gave, they're talking about it being made of oak. I'm not sure. Usually they're made of yew, okay? But excitingly enough, I did mention it in the talk that perhaps we'd look at this crosier in a bit more detail. And so we're going to scientifically identify the wood of the core, the wooden core. So we'll find out, definitely we'll get a wood specialist to look at that. So we'll find out whether it's yew or whether it's oak or what it is. And then more excitingly again, we're actually going to have that radiocarbon dated. And that's just got news that we've got funding there from the Royal Irish Academy and Queen's University Belfast.
Brilliant.
Their radiocarbon lab to do that. So that's going to be happening in the next few months. And that's going to tell us then, I had my theory about this whole thing was remounted in the later medieval period, perhaps the 14th or 15th century. This will tell us whether I'm right or wrong on that.
Oh, great. Oh, wow. Well, we might have to get you back for another online talk, Griffin, I think, because it sounds like there's a lot of exciting work going to happen in the next year. Somebody was saying how wonderful the talk was and they want to visit the exhibition. Beverly did. Sophie Kelly asks us about just sort of thanks ever so much for such an interesting talk. Is there any evidence for crosiers being buried with their owners, as in England, or are they almost always passed down?
Yeah, great question there as well. So these type of crosiers that we get, these sort of what I refer to as insular type or Irish type, we get the same type in Scotland as well. There's some, and I mentioned the Dunkeld example that no longer survives, but there are surviving examples in Scotland. These particular types of crosiers from the early medieval period are handed down. We have none. We have no real early crosiers surviving from England. The earliest ones tend to be 11th, 12th century. In this period, there seems to be a kind of a shift, particularly this type of crosier is no longer made after the 12th century. Okay, they don't make them after the 12th century. They're using them as relics and things like that in the period, but they're not making them. Nobody's making them after the 12th century. And why is that? And I think it has an awful lot to do with the church reforms that came in the 12th century, where basically the power of abbots diminished and the power of bishops increased. And so there was a shift in the dynamic there. And from that period, from the 12th century on, we do get examples of crosiers being actually buried with bishops. But as I say, then that's more a personal property. But there are different types of crosiers. We've one from Haddo in County Kerry. There's one from Cashel. There's many others, Yeah.
Okay. Just to say, somebody from Brazil has said hello, and they really enjoyed the talk. So that's hello to. Thank you very much for tuning in from Brazil. That's a long way away today, and so that was Maria. So thank you. Hello to Maria there. Just Fiona Nugent, actually, just on that idea of the hereditary connections of these and the keepers of these crosiers, and I suppose just thinking a little bit about that, and she's just asking, how certain is the connection between crosiers and individual monasteries? I suppose given that most of them were with hereditary keepers for much of their later life. So I suppose it's just, how certain are we, about the connection of the crosiers to particular saints and monasteries, given, I suppose, the hereditary keepers then. And I suppose, many shrines and relics, not just crosiers, have hereditary keepers. So that's maybe another one that nearly deserves a lecture in itself. But if you have any thoughts on that, if you just want to tell us.
But yeah, this is really the most fascinating. This is the fascinating thing about this exhibition, and this is the fascinating thing about all this material. The fascinating thing is that this material has survived for us.
It is.
And if you know anything about Irish history, like in the last few hundred years, it was pretty turbulent, and
Definitely.
as we know, the penal laws, an awful lot of suppression of Catholicism. So this is material that was literally hidden away, hidden under beds, hidden in the thatch of houses. It's remarkable that this material survives at all. And, a crosier isn't exactly the easiest thing to hide, okay? They're a bit, they're kind of long, and, but yeah, it's thanks to these families and this tradition within these families that kept these objects for hundreds of years after the dissolution of the monasteries, and kept them safely for hundreds of years until, as I said, the kind of the power of the Catholic Church kind of regained power again. These objects were very, very much seen as kind of superstitious. So they were kind of frowned upon by the Catholic Church in the 19th century. So dynamics were shifting. We had the famine. Lots of things were happening in the 19th century that kind of transformed. The communities, I suppose, in many cases were decimated in the famine, and the material moved into the hands of private collectors, antiquarians, and eventually made its way to museums. But if we look, and just very quickly, if we look at the hereditary keepers, like the McGeoghans in this case, or other cases, we can see that those families had connections with the monasteries themselves, with the particular monasteries. So often McGeoghans are minor kings in the area. Often the hereditary keepers were a kind of an ecclesiastical family associated with the site itself. So we can be pretty confident about that. Yeah, we can be pretty confident. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, well, listen, I think we will be leaving it at that today. I think Finola Finlay is the last person there, just saying a thank you as well to you for that fantastic talk. And listen, Griffin, we really appreciate you and Cormac, and also Paul, and those others who share all their knowledge and their research with us. So I hope everybody will get in to see the exhibition. You do have to book a free ticket. It's online. So don't forget to do that before you come here to the Archaeology Museum on Kildare Street. And thank you very much for tuning in today. And thanks again, Griffin, and also to Tricia and Matthew Lester and Grace O'Sullivan, who also helped out, and our IT wizard, Gavin. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Siobhan. Thank you.